It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. It's been great to learn from my colleagues, and I hope you all have been learning as well. My name is William Clark, and I work for the National Conference of State Legislatures. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the modernization trends across the 50 states of the US, as well as 5 US territories and DC. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to be focusing on some areas where there's some general similarities across the states, some areas where there's some variation across the states, and then I'll be talking about accessibility, which is a huge issue in the United States right now, and then I'll be talking about legislative use of artificial intelligence. Before I do, just a bit about our organization. We are a bipartisan organization. We're not a nonprofit. We're not a state government. We're made up of all of the 50 states, and so our governing body is legislators and legislative staff, and we're supported by all 50 states and the 5 US territories. We provide many services to our states. We conduct policy research, we make connections between the states, we provide training, and we facilitate many meetings throughout the year. And we also represent state legislatures at the federal level, so we provide a connection between the 50 state governments and our federal government. We have a lot of conversations with both Congress and with congressional staff in the House and in the Senate. And we just celebrated our 50th anniversary as an organization. So we are 50 years old, and that was a very large milestone for us. And here's a map of our members. The entire United States, and they're all very different. And one of the key terms that we like to use when we talk about our members is that they are laboratories of democracy. And that's because every single one of these states is a different government. They're all independent. They're all incredibly different. They have different histories, different traditions, different constitutions, different laws, and different legal histories. And so because of that, you have lots of different approaches to the same problems, which leads to, in some instances, best practices, but in others, it's usually the practices that work well for those types of systems that have developed independently over time. So again, getting back to my agenda for today to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to be talking about some legislative drafting systems, I'm going to be talking about cybersecurity, and I'm going to be talking about the different ways that legislatures have been trying to increase accessibility to state legislative proceedings. And then I'm going to end my presentation by talking about what we currently know about legislative use of AI in the US. But I also wanted to recognize there are other areas of modernization. Our organization also addresses these, but I will not be talking about them today. But that includes legislative sessions, the work that legislative staff do to conduct business. I won't be talking about that. We also do a lot of work around legislative salary. That's a huge issue in the United States because there are some state legislatures where members get paid quite a bit. They're professionalized positions, but there are other legislatures where legislators do not get paid anything, where they get paid very, very little for the work that they do. And then, of course, the professional development of legislative staff. So I won't be talking about these, but they're very important in the United States. So we conduct a lot of survey work, and so with legislative drafting, this is an area where every single legislature has to conduct this activity, but they all do it in very different ways. So we've been surveying on this issue for a long time now, but we've done some surveys recently to talk about some more modern elements, and there's quite a bit of variation actually, was what we found. So one of the highest commonalities for modernizing legislative drafting processes is just to see, we asked them, does your bill drafting system use XML as a data standard? 70% of respondents said that they do. We also asked them if they plan to integrate AI into their drafting systems, and as of last year, only 21% said that they were planning to integrate AI into their drafting systems. So we know, and I'll talk about a bit about this later in the presentation, we know that some are starting to use AI unofficially for certain drafting processes, but legislatures generally are not looking to incorporate this yet. We also asked if they're using cloud-based drafting services, so not just off-prem, but from a vendor using the cloud, and only 8% said that they were doing that. However, there are a lot of legislatures that use or are planning to use web-based drafting tools. So I think legislatures are trying to maintain control of those systems, which maybe explains the difference between those last two bullets. Cybersecurity, however, is an area where there's a lot of similarities across legislatures. They're using a lot of the same tools, and I think that's because we all face the same risks right now in our modern environment. Number one being multi-factor authentication. There are some legislatures that do not require multi-factor authentication for access to their legislative environments. There are very few, but for the most part, they all use these tools. Frequency of password changes is also something that is becoming more important. It seems basic, but again, there are some legislatures that do not require password changes. It's a very simple cybersecurity principle. And again, I'm just mentioning these just to give you an idea that across 50 states, you're getting 50 different solutions to very similar problems, but there are some commonalities. Intrusion detection systems are very common across legislatures, usually provided by a vendor. However, we're starting to see behavioral analytics being implemented as well for security threats. So that's looking at the behavior of people who are logged in. So it might be an employee who is accessing information in a way that they shouldn't, but it also might be an external threat who has gained access. And so we're starting to see more systems that analyze the behavior of staff or members within a system. We've also been doing a lot of work on security trainings for staff and members to make them aware of best practices for ensuring the safety of their systems. Geo-blocking is something that was actually implemented pretty extensively across states, but they have since started to limit that because of VPNs and how you can mask your IP address. But this was a practice that was pretty common. And then, of course, virtual private networks. Almost all legislatures in the US now use these, but it's primarily for remote work for their staff and their employees. So again, those are kind of some contrasting areas, some areas where there are commonalities across the states, and then areas where there's a lot of differentiation. But one big concept I want to talk about, it's something that all legislatures have been trying to deal with, is increasing access to their processes. And so this is a furtherance of democracy. So there's kind of three main areas that legislatures have been trying to do this. One is access to information. I think we've been talking about that a lot in this conference as one of the most important, having the public have access to bills, proceedings, various other information, but also access to members. So how can the public actually directly engage with their representatives? And then something that a lot of states in the US have been conducting a lot of work on and investing a lot of money in over the last couple decades is the actual access to proceedings, so improving their physical infrastructure. Also, so kind of getting into accessibility of information, one of the biggest issues currently facing state governments, state legislatures in the United States, is compliance with web content accessibility guidelines. So there was a rule that was passed by our Department of Justice, so at the federal level, that requires all state governments of a certain size to comply with these guidelines. And so they've had some time to plan to integrate these into their processes. This deadline was last month, and many legislatures were not in compliance with these standards. It was something that caught a lot of them off guard. There were many that were complying, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those guidelines look like in case you're not familiar. But it was looking like a bit of a temporary crisis, and so that rule actually got extended, so we have one more year, but this is top of the mind for many IT staff and legislatures as they work to comply with these standards. And so what these standards do, if you're not familiar, they increase accessibility to legislative activity. I'll get into some of the components again, but at a high level, they're meant to, especially for people who are visually impaired, they're meant to increase accessibility to proceedings by using readers. But in the US, one really important thing is that it will, by complying with these, you will be avoiding legal liability because there are strong protections for individuals with disabilities, and legislatures will now, if they are not in compliance with these standards, they will open themselves up to liability from people who are not able to access the legislative environment. One side effect, though, of complying with these standards is it makes this information a lot more easily engaged with by modern systems, including with artificial intelligence. And so you have an opportunity for restructuring data, which can be incredibly valuable, again, not letting a crisis go to waste. And again, just some examples if you're not familiar with these standards. There are a long list of requirements in the guidelines. So it's things like text spacing, ensuring that if you have an image, that you have some sort of text that describes that information, and also making sure that you have certain buttons that are a certain size or they have sufficient spacing. And so there are hundreds of different little requirements in these standards. And so all state legislatures in a year will need to comply with those standards. So this is one of the biggest issues facing legislatures right now. I talked also about access to members. And so this is something that has been top of mind for members for quite a while. And there are many different options, but in our modern environment, because of electronic communication, legislatures and legislators specifically are starting to be bombarded by communications from many different parties. So you have your traditional constituents that are wanting to reach out to their representatives to talk about issues that they care about. You also have special interests that want to connect with their members. They're also getting information from various parties. And then you also have an incredible amount of spam that is now coming in, specifically generated by artificial intelligence. And so their email boxes are being bombarded by this information. So constituent relationship management systems serve a dual purpose. One, it helps filter out information for legislators so they know what is legitimate information that they need, but it also helps sort that information, and so it helps them with responding, especially to their constituents, which is incredibly important just for their public image, but also for ensuring democratic involvement. There are many tools that we've seen developed right now. We have many examples. There are some that are more off-the-shelf, commercial off-the-shelf options, but these are tools also that a lot of legislatures develop themselves. It used to be that they would use simple databases to collect outreach that they would get from constituents, but they're getting more and more sophisticated. But essentially, what you're doing is you're just organizing the contacts that you get, and then you're taking that information and making it more accessible later on and using it for analysis and evaluation. So ideally, you have a form that you would fill out, and then as we modernize, we get better ways of filling out these forms. But ultimately, you can do really cool things with this information. So hypothetically, if you had an issue that only impacted constituents in a certain area, for example, in that red area, you could look at the outreach that you've gotten as a representative to say, what have I heard from my members in this area that will be impacted? And that can help you to make decisions on behalf of your constituents. So just one way to use these tools. But these tools are starting to become more important, and it's an area of modernization that continues to grow in the legislatures in the US. And then the last area for just kind of general modernization that I wanted to talk about are Capitol building upgrades. So we have a lot of new construction. We have a lot of old buildings in the United States. And so a lot of money is being invested into building new buildings, doing building upgrades, creating ADA accessibility in the buildings and then access to those buildings. Also, hearing room expansion is really important. A lot of these older buildings have small rooms. You have people waiting in the halls, and it can be very difficult to have people come and talk on bills. And then also hearing room technology. And so this is something that I think that we've talked a bit about. All US states have broadcasted committee hearings, and that'll be important too as we talk about artificial intelligence in terms of getting transcripts. But these are all the ways that legislatures have been trying to increase physical accessibility. And I just wanted to show an example of what that looks like in practice. So Alabama is a state in the southern United States. This is the building on their left is their current state house, and I've been there, I visited it. It is very dated, and it needed some improvement, and so this building on the right is what they're currently constructing right now. I've been there, and it's about 2/3 of the way completed. Very beautiful building, and it's gonna have a lot of nice modern amenities. But one instance is just, this is the current Senate in the Alabama legislature, and you can see those pillars. It was beautiful at its time, but if you can imagine either working as a staff or working as a member, trying to engage with the speaker or engage with the president or even just amongst yourselves, it is a very challenging space. And so they're looking at opening that up. Not too far. Opening that up to increase line of sight. And then another issue that they've had, and this is common across a lot of legislatures, is just, again, having these small rooms where it can be limiting the number of people that can engage in the process, and just improving that technology as well to make it open. And so this is a lot of states have been working on developing this infrastructure, similar to what you have here. You're making this more accessible environment to the public. All right, so that was kind of my general modernization. I wanted to talk a bit about what we know in terms of legislative use of AI in the United States. So we've been looking at this issue now for about 3 years, and a lot has happened, but in some ways not a lot has happened. And so there are really 3 main ways right now that state legislatures have been implementing artificial intelligence in their processes. One, and perhaps one of the most common, is embedded AI in existing applications. So for example, most state legislatures in the US use Microsoft Office. And so it's not much work to get Copilot licenses, it just costs money. So things like that. But existing applications that now have AI functionality, that's one of the most common ways that state legislatures have been adopting artificial intelligence. Also creation of custom GPTs. This is a newer development. Most legislatures have not been doing this. If they have, and I'll give an example, but for the most part, the most common one is just having chatbots, internal chatbots for accessing information, but there are also some public-facing chatbots as well. But by far, the most common usage of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence in state legislatures is large language models by staff and by members. It's by far the most common usage. And we can talk about why here in a bit. But this is an example of embedded AI. So this is from the state of North Dakota. It's a pretty common looking platform. They record their proceedings in committees and on the floor. And this is an example of a committee hearing where you can see on the right, there are the people, and so a nice new functionality is you can see when someone spoke, you can click on that, it'll take you right to where they are in the video, and then you can also see on the bottom there that there's the transcript, so there's captions that are contributing to a transcript. So this is pretty standard, but the nice thing that they've done, so they work with a private vendor, but one nice thing they have now is this. It doesn't look that fancy, but it is incredibly powerful because of this. You have lots of ways of searching through their entire caption history and all of their transcripts for keywords, for people, and then within a date range. And then, so for example, I searched for nuclear, that was that last hearing. It'll take you to that hearing, and if you click on that text, it'll take you to exactly where that was in the video. So again, I know a lot of parliaments internationally have been working on this technology, but in the US, this is fairly new, and being able to go specifically to a certain part of a meeting is really great and innovative across many of the legislatures. An example of a pre-trained GPT is we have in Minnesota, they speak 4 different languages. There are 4 main languages that are spoken in Minnesota. One of them is Spanish, and so luckily, I think even just using Google Translate for Spanish, it's not perfect, but it's high quality right now because there's so much information online between English and Spanish. But there are also a lot of Somali residents in Minnesota. That is a language that does not have a lot of translations between English and their language, and so in order to increase accessibility to proceedings, they have an on-demand translation service, and so there are people that have to individually translate documents from English into the Somali language. And so they've started to train a GPT to actually help with that process. And so even though it's not a transformative process, as they train it, as it learns, as it gets more accurate, it takes something that maybe would have taken a translator an hour, and now it takes 15 minutes. So it can save, over time, it can save an incredible amount of time. And this is just one application of a GPT just being used for language translation. And again, this isn't part of their system. It's something that they downloaded from ChatGPT and that they've been working on. So getting back to my original statement, I said, by far the greatest usage of general artificial intelligence by state legislatures is large language models. And how do we know that? We've been doing survey work. So we've done survey work for 3 years. We've asked people some very basic questions with some follow-up questions. And the general question is, are you currently using generative AI tools for legislative work? That's the main question we ask. We ask some other follow-up questions, but this has been one of the most important ones. And in 2024, only 20% of respondents said that they were currently using these tools. You contrast that with 2025, 44% said that they were using these tools, about double. And then right now we're currently in the middle of survey work. You see we've breached that 50% mark. And so when we ask people if they're using these tools, if they say yes, we ask what tools are they using, what are they using them for? And by far, the top responses are always ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Gemini, and now Cloud. And they're using these tools for a variety of work. So in some instances, in most instances, they're licenses that they own, that they have privately. So the legislature is not providing them with the license, they're getting it themselves, they're doing the work on their own. So this is largely unguided usage. So this is staff getting a paid version of ChatGPT and then using it for conducting some of their legislative work. There are exceptions because there are some states that are starting to provide their staff with enterprise licenses for Microsoft Copilot and other platforms, but a lot of this is driven by staff having their own licenses and doing work on their own. So I think it's more common than our survey would suggest, I think. But I mentioned also that we asked staff, what are they using these tools for? And so by far the number one is research. That term encompasses many different things, but really it's looking up reports. It might even be for legal research, but just doing that first search on a topic and trying to get information. And so that's a lot of what our organization, me and people in my organization use it for as well. I think we've all used it in that way. You ask it a question and it can give you some results. Editing communications is by far the second most commonly cited usage of these tools. So things like writing emails, writing a first draft. Summarization, though, I think has come to be one of the most common usage and one of the most useful because as all of you, if you've used large language models, you can plug in very complex documents, long documents, and with the right context, it can be incredibly valuable for pulling out either main points or pointing you to places in a document with information you're trying to look for. So if you are trying to analyze a very large court case or 100 to 200 page research paper, instead of really needing to read it yourself, that first take can be done by a large language model, and that's how a lot of staff are using it. Transcription, of course, we talked a bit about that, but I think most legislatures have been using some form of AI for transcription for a long time, and now it's just getting better. But this is probably one of the most commonly accepted uses. I think it's not very controversial. Coding and programming, of course, many of you might have used this for coding and programming. This is a bit more controversial for the same reason why using generative AI for legal drafting is controversial, is that you want to make sure that your staff actually know how to code or know how to draft legally before you're using these programs to develop really important infrastructure for your organization. And then drafting documents and bills. Again, drafting documents is different than bills, but we are starting to see more and more legislatures warming up to the idea of using generative AI for some of the bill drafting process. It might be for simple resolutions. It might be for ensuring that things are codified correctly, but it's getting more and more accepted as a potential use, I think, as people get more comfortable with these tools. So because unstructured use of generative artificial intelligence is, as we know so far, the most common type of usage, guidance in the US is now incredibly important. Having a policy that tells staff what they can and can't do is incredibly important to protect the institution, but also to protect staff so that they don't do something that might get them in trouble. So along with our other survey work that we've conducted in 2024 and in 2025, we asked, does your office currently have an AI usage policy to help guide staff usage? 20% in 2024 said that they did. That number was the same in 2025. So if you remember, usage doubled between 2024 and 2025, but the number of offices that said they had a policy to guide staff usage stayed the same. But in 2026 so far, like I said, we're still surveying right now, that number jumped up to 46%. So it was a huge jump, and so we're seeing a lot more awareness now, I think, by directors of legislative agencies that this is really important because they're starting to see for themselves that staff are using these tools. It's very important to tell them kind of what they should allow. So we are now aware of at least 28 state legislatures that have a policy, but kind of like the diffuse use of AI by staff. Most of these policies are for individual offices. They're not legislature-wide. So really, it's a director of a state legislative agency. They understand that their staff are using these tools, and then they create a policy for their staff, but it doesn't apply to the rest of the legislature. But there are at least 11 legislatures that do have a legislature-wide policy, and this is increasing, and we're starting to work with more states on this. There's some really common components, as you can imagine, but there are really kind of three types of policies. So there are policies that prohibit the use of AI tools. And there are still legislatures that do this. They had this policy and then they wanted time to analyze whether or not they still wanted to prohibit this, and they decided to continue prohibiting use. So there are multiple legislatures in the US or agencies that still do not allow their staff to use these tools for their work. Probably the most common policy is just 1 or 2 paragraphs in a staff manual that says, if you're going to use these tools, be careful. And just highlighting some of those risks of the tools, that's probably the most common. And I think this is more of a stopgap. And as we're starting to see more comprehensive policies being developed, and of those comprehensive policies, you have a lot of common elements. So prohibiting the use of confidential information in these tools, setting an allowable list of tools. So that might be saying you can only use an enterprise version of Microsoft Copilot, or you can only use it to do this. So for example, for drafters, you can't use it to actually draft a bill, but you can use it to summarize it, things like that. A lot of states now are having a requirement where you need to get consent from your manager before you can use it, or consent from your department or your IT department potentially. And now we're seeing more and more training required, which prior to this, I think a lot of legislatures were still trying to figure out whether or not to use it. Now we're entering a stage of higher development where now we're actually providing training for staff and how to use these effectively. So I think this is a really transformative moment where instead of saying, should we use these tools, they're saying, okay, we accept that you're probably going to use these tools. Here's how to use them the best way for our work. And then more and more, there are some legislatures that want a disclaimer on AI-generated materials. However, there is some debate around this because the idea is that you can treat large language models like an intern, perhaps. If you use an intern for legislative work, you wouldn't say, intern was used for this work, because you're ultimately responsible for that work product. So there are some instances maybe where it's really important to have a disclaimer, but this is a debated topic right now in state legislatures. So that concludes my spoken remarks. We have some resources where you can see some of the information that I talked about today. Again, it was a pleasure to be here with you all, and I thank you for your attention.